The rain hammered against the loading dock at exactly 6:47 a.m. when Marisol Ferrante stepped out of her black sedan, heels clicking against wet concrete, and watched a security guard escort a soaked, trembling man named Desmond Okafor out of the building he had walked into every single day for 11 years. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew he was 4 minutes late, and in her world, 4 minutes was the difference between a shipment reaching Ohio on time or costing the company $200,000 in penalties. She had built Ferrante Logistics from a single delivery van into a $50 million empire by being unforgiving about exactly these kinds of details, and she intended to stay that way. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that people are more than their worst moment, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Kindness Thread so you never miss a story like this one. Desmond stood in the rain without an umbrella, his gray work jacket darkening with each passing second, and he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he has absorbed so many blows in life that one more barely registers, and he turned to walk toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. What Marisol didn't see, because she never bothered to look, was that Desmond had been awake since 3 a.m. that morning, sitting in a hospital hallway with his 16-year-old daughter, Aria, who had collapsed from a severe asthma attack. He had left the hospital only when the doctors assured him she was stable, sprinting 6 blocks in the rain because his car had broken down weeks earlier and he hadn't yet saved enough to fix it. 4 minutes late. 11 years of perfect attendance. Gone in the time it took to sign a termination form. Marisol walked into her glass-walled office on the top floor of the building, shrugged off her drenched coat, and sat down at her desk, already forgetting the man's face. She had a system to run. Ferrante Logistics moved packages across 14 states using a proprietary warehouse routing software that her operations director, a nervous young man named Callum Bright, had once told her was, honestly, a miracle, works better than anything we ever paid consultants for. She'd nodded along without really listening, the way successful people sometimes stop listening to the machinery beneath their success once it simply works. That afternoon, the machinery stopped working. At 2:15 p.m., the warehouse routing system crashed. Not a small glitch, a total failure. Package sorting halted, drivers sat idle, and $300,000 in same-day deliveries sat frozen on conveyor belts while Callum Bright paced outside Marisol's office, sweat beading on his forehead. When she demanded to know what was happening, he told her something that made her stomach drop. The system had been designed and personally maintained, line by line, for the last 11 years, by one employee. A warehouse worker. The same warehouse worker she had fired that morning in the rain. He built it? Marisol asked, her voice flat with disbelief. A warehouse worker built our entire routing infrastructure? Callum nodded, visibly terrified. He never told anyone because he didn't have a degree, and honestly, ma'am, he was worried it would make him replaceable if people knew how much of it depended on him. He just kept fixing it quietly. Every single day. Nobody else understands the code. There's no documentation. It's all in his head. For the first time in years, Marisol Ferrante felt something close to panic. She had built her identity on control, on being the sharpest person in every room, and now she was being told that the backbone of her company's $10 million a year efficiency had been sustained not by the engineers she paid 6 figures, but by a man she had discarded in the rain over 4 minutes. She spent the next 3 hours watching her company hemorrhage money while IT specialists flown in from 2 different contracting firms stared blankly at code they couldn't decipher. By 6 p.m., desperate and humiliated, Marisol did something she had never done in 15 years of running her business. She got into her car and drove to find an employee's home address. Desmond lived in a modest apartment above a laundromat on the east side of the city, the kind of building with a buzzer system that only half worked. When Marisol knocked, it was Aria who opened the door, an oxygen tube still faintly visible beneath her collar from the hospital visit, her eyes wary at the sight of a stranger in an expensive coat. Desmond appeared behind her, and when he saw Marisol's face, something in his expression didn't harden into anger. it simply went tired, the exhaustion of a man who had spent his whole life being underestimated and had stopped being surprised by it. Marisol didn't lead with an apology, because in that moment she genuinely didn't know how. Instead she said, "Your system crashed. Nobody can fix it. I need you to come back." It was blunt, transactional, exactly the kind of sentence that had built her empire and exactly the kind of sentence that revealed how little she'd learned in a single day. Desmond studied her for a long moment, and something in his silence carried more weight than shouting ever could have. Then he said quietly that he had spent 11 years building something that mattered, something that kept 200 families employed and packages moving to people who needed them, and that he had done it not for recognition but because it was good work, honest work, and he had believed that was enough to be treated with basic dignity. He told her that he hadn't been late once in over a decade, and that morning, his daughter had been struggling to breathe in a hospital bed, and he had run through the rain praying he'd make it in time, not for his shift, but because he loved his job and he didn't want to let anyone down. And instead of asking what happened, instead of even wondering if something was wrong, she had let him go without a single question. Marisol stood in that hallway, rain-damp coat still clinging to her shoulders, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had no comeback, no defense, nothing but the sinking realization that her entire company ran on the labor of people she had never once thought to truly see. She thought of her own father, a mechanic who had raised her alone after her mother left, a man who used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those above them, but how they treat those below them. She had built a glass office to look down from, and somewhere along the way, she had forgotten to look at all. She asked if she could come in, not to talk business, but to understand. Desmond hesitated, then stepped aside. Over the next hour, sitting at a small kitchen table with cracked linoleum, Marisol learned that Desmond had taught himself programming from library books after being laid off from a factory job at 19, that he had never finished college because his mother got sick and he needed to work, that he had built the routing system originally just to make his own job easier, and it had grown, quietly, into the nervous system of a company that had never once asked his name in a meeting. She learned that Arya wanted to study aerospace engineering, that Desmond kept a folder of her report cards in his work locker because he was prouder of them than anything he'd ever coded, and that despite everything, despite 11 years of invisible labor, he had never once complained. Marisol went back to her office that night and didn't fire anyone. Instead, she rewrote her own understanding of what leadership meant. Desmond returned to work 3 days later, not as a warehouse floor employee, but as director of systems infrastructure, with a salary that finally matched the value he had been providing all along, full healthcare for his daughter, and a formal education stipend so he could finally earn the degree life had never given him time to pursue. Marisol personally walked the warehouse floor every morning after that, learning names, asking about families, understanding that the 4 minutes that once cost a man his dignity were never the real story at all. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness and second chances still matter in this world. Months later, during a company town hall, Marisol stood in front of every employee, from the executives in tailored suits to the newest warehouse hires still learning the floor, and told them the story of the morning she fired a man in the rain without asking why, and how that mistake taught her more about leadership than any business degree ever had. Desmond sat in the front row, Arya beside him on a rare day off from school, both of them smiling not out of triumph, but out of quiet gratitude that sometimes, even late, people find their way back to seeing each other clearly. Before you go, if this story moved you even a little, drop a comment below with just one word, kindness, so we know this story reached you, and so Kindness Thread can keep bringing you stories that remind us who we really want to be. And so Ferrante Logistics kept moving packages across 14 states, but it moved differently now, built not just on efficient code, but on the understanding that behind every system, every deadline, and every quiet employee showing up rain or shine, there is a whole human life worth asking about before judgment ever comes. I'll take that as approval to go ahead. I'll write a brand new story, same emotional style, with a fresh title, cast, and plot so it doesn't repeat Desmond and Marisol's story. A pharmaceutical CEO named Vivian Callahan stood in a marble-floored lobby at 5:58 a.m. and fired the janitor mopping near the elevator bank for loitering during business hours, never once imagining that the quiet man in gray coveralls, Thaddeus Whitlock, was the very chemist who had invented the compound formula keeping her entire company alive. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that people are so much more than their job title, hit that like button, drop a comment, share this video, and subscribe to Kindness Thread so you never miss a story like this one. Vivian had inherited Callahan Pharmaceuticals from her father 4 years earlier, and she ran it the way she believed strength required: sharp, cold, immovable. She walked past Thaddeus twice a week without a glance, seeing only a mop bucket and a name badge, never the man behind it. That morning, irritated after a board call about slipping stock prices, she saw him pause near the executive elevator, phone in hand, and snap that Callahan Pharmaceuticals didn't pay people to stand around. Thaddeus tried to explain he was checking on his wife, who was in labor 2 states away with their first grandchild, but Vivian wasn't listening. Within the hour, security walked him out. She didn't think of him again until 11 a.m., when her head of R&D, a frazzled woman named Priya Nakamura, burst into her office holding a manila folder with trembling hands. The company's flagship compound, the one responsible for 80% of their revenue, had hit a stability wall in its new formulation, one that had stumped 3 consecutive research teams for 6 months. Priya said the only person who had ever solved this exact problem before, back when the drug was first developed 22 years ago, was a lab technician named Thaddeus Whitlock, a man without a PhD, without a title, who had quietly authored the very stabilization method the whole formula depended on, before being demoted decades earlier during a corporate restructuring nobody remembered, and reassigned to facilities because downsizing needed somewhere invisible to put a good man. Vivian sat in stunned silence, staring at a name she now recognized as the same man she had fired that morning over nothing. She drove 2 hours to the small town where Thaddeus lived, arriving at a modest brick house with a wheelchair ramp built for his aging mother, and found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at his phone, waiting for news from the hospital 2 states away. He looked up at Vivian with no anger, only fatigue, and told her plainly that he didn't need this conversation today, that his daughter was in labor and he simply wanted to be near his phone in peace. Vivian, for once, didn't lead with business. She asked if she could sit down, and when he allowed it, she admitted she had no idea who he really was, that she'd looked at coveralls and a mop and decided that was the whole of him. Over the next hour, sitting on those porch steps, Vivian learned that Thaddeus had once been the brightest young chemist in the company's history, that he'd turned down offers to move to another firm because he believed in the medicine they were building, medicine his own mother now depended on, and that when the restructuring came, no one had bothered to ask what he knew, only what his title said. He'd spent the last 2 decades quietly maintaining machines and mopping floors, watching younger executives struggle to solve problems he'd already solved once, never saying a word, because the last time he'd tried to speak up in a meeting, he'd been reminded he wasn't paid to have opinions. Vivian asked, quietly, why he never left. Thaddeus said something that stayed with her long after she drove home that night, that he still believed the medicine mattered more than his pride, and that somewhere out there, a stranger's life depended on that formula working, and that mattered more to him than being seen. That night, Vivian authorized Priya's team to reach out to Thaddeus directly, not as a janitor doing anyone a favor, but as a consultant, paid properly, treated as the expert he had always been. Thaddeus initially refused, still raw from the morning's humiliation, until word came that his daughter had safely delivered a healthy baby girl, and in that rush of joy and relief, he found himself thinking about the kind of world he wanted his granddaughter to grow up in, one where being underestimated didn't have to be permanent. He returned 3 days later, not to mop floors, but to sit in the research lab he had once been quietly erased from, walking Priya's team through a stabilization method he had carried in his memory for over 20 years, waiting, without realizing it, for someone to finally ask. If this story is touching your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that people deserve to be seen for who they truly are. Vivian didn't stop there. She had HR pull every personnel file quietly reassigned during that old restructuring, and found 4 more employees like Thaddeus, brilliant people demoted into invisibility over decades, and personally called each of them. She created a new internal review board specifically to catch talent the company had overlooked, chaired, at his request, by Thaddeus himself. 6 months later, the stabilized formula relaunched successfully, saving the company an estimated $11 million in projected losses, but Vivian found herself caring less about the number and more about the quiet dignity restored to a man who had spent 22 years being told his value ended at a mop bucket. At the product relaunch event, Vivian stood in front of the entire company and told them, without polish or spin, about the morning she fired a man for loitering without ever asking why, and how that single act of carelessness had almost cost the company everything, not because of one crisis, but because it revealed how blind she had let herself become to the people actually holding the company together. Thaddeus sat in the front row, his newborn granddaughter's photo tucked in his breast pocket, listening quietly, the way he always had. Before we close this story, if it moved you even a little, please type the word "seen" in the comments below, so we know this story reached your heart, and so Kindness Thread can keep telling stories that remind people they are never as invisible as the world sometimes makes them feel. Vivian changed the way she walked through that building after that. She learned every name on every floor, not because a crisis forced her to, but because she never again wanted to almost lose someone simply because she hadn't bothered to look. And somewhere in that quiet shift, Callahan Pharmaceuticals became not just a stronger company, but a kinder one, built at last on the simple, overdue understanding that the person mopping the floor at 6 a.m. might just be the reason everything above them still stands.